Welcome to Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails. I'm in eastern Kansas today, and this is close to the tail end of our trip. We started a week ago, headed out to the Hoyt plant out in Utah, and Jordan stayed at the hotel. She's catching up on laundry, I guess. But I'm here with Rob Whiteley, and Rob owns, that's 191 acres, right?
Uh-huh.
And I was here last winter on a consulting visit. This is something that I do as a side business. I do about 15 of them a year. It's kind of my target. It's not a real big business, but it's a lot of fun to get out and meet people like Rob and, hopefully get challenged by some of these properties that we come in contact with. But thought it would be fun to bring you an episode about how we break down a property like this and some of the challenges and the opportunities that we look at in the process of doing one of these on-site consultations. So we're going to go for a little walk here, and along the way I'm going to pop in and Rob and I are going to discuss different aspects of his property, some of the things that he's experienced here, and then hopefully some solutions that we can come up with for him. So we've covered a little bit of ground. We're only maybe 150 yards from the truck, but we've started our discussion about the huntability of the property versus the habitat. And I'm going to move this camera just a little bit so I'm out of the wind. Let's see, how can we do this? Let's go this way. Nope, there's no way out of the wind. This is Kansas. There's no way out of the wind. So the trade-off is where do you put your time and effort? What are you focusing on? Are you focusing on how to hunt it, or are you focusing on how to set up the property, how to do the habitat part, and then let the hunting take care of itself? And I guess I'm of the school of thought that you make the property the best that you possibly can, and then you hunt the spots that make sense. I'm not the opposite. Some people like to say, well, let's set this farm up for easy hunting. I guess that never made sense to me. I feel like you make it the best you possibly can for the deer so that they're here. The hardest part is getting a 5 or 6 year old buck on your property. Once he's there, killing him is a lot easier than getting him there. It's the biggest challenge we face. I mean, I didn't have one on my farm this past season. Right. Did you have one?
No.
Yeah, so no. It's not about killing him. He wasn't here.
Right.
So the challenge is to get him here. So we got to set the farm up in a way that makes them come here and want to stay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I focus on habitat and to a lesser extent food. And then the exact locations of tree stands and stuff like that kind of falls in later.
Present themselves.
Yeah. So the spot we're looking at right now is pretty close to the road. It's more just old pasture. We're trying to figure out what to do with it. And obviously we've got two things we can do. It can either be food or cover. And the thought was, let's just take the simplest approach first and plant it to food. Get some corn growing in here. Gives Rob an edge inside the property where he can sit on. He can be just inside the corn, hunting a timber edge that keeps him away from going deeper into the property. Mm-hmm. And then as time goes by, maybe a year or two later, if he's thinking, hey, I want more habitat, or this corn isn't working here, then he's mellowed out the seed bed enough that it'd be pretty easy to till it and plant the tree seeds similar to what I've done in the past, where you'd spread the acorns and just till them in. So these are the kind of things that we look at. We're going to keep going, but my philosophy is habitat first, food second, and then the hunting locations. Where do you sit after that? Because we had that conversation. You don't need to create sanctuaries on your property if the whole property is a sanctuary. Mm-hmm. So if you're hunting it carefully enough, you're only hunting the fringes, the deer don't know that you're hunting it, then the whole property is a sanctuary. And you just put enough time in, and you're eventually going to kill whatever's there.
Instead of going into what you perceive to be the best spot where all the action is, you're allowing the action to take place all over, and you're hunting what's accessible and easy exit. Yeah. And you can maintain that good hunting, just not on the perceived best part of the farm.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part for people to digest, is that you don't necessarily want to hunt the spot that looks the best. Where the big, or scrape is at the bottom of the valley, and you can envision that 180-inch buck coming down there and tearing it up. But I also envision that deer snorting at you from 150 yards away and never coming in. So I think I'd rather kill that 150-inch deer right up here, or 180-inch deer. We're not going to go 150s.
Not yet, no.
We're going to go up along this edge. We're gonna make him come out to us. He may not do it near as often, but he's gonna be here. We're not in there educating a bunch of deer, making this hard to hunt. We're making it really good for the deer, and then hunting them around the outside edges where it's favorable for us to get in and out. So let's keep walking.
Okay.
We're just a little further along the edge of that draw, and there's some nice trails here. There's some buck sign, scrapes. They're already kind of using this anyway, and by planting something that separates this from the road, you make just enough of a buffer that you can hunt on the inside of that. It serves a lot of purposes. So the whole goal, of course, like we were talking about, is not to dive into the middle of the property. So anything we can do to set up really good, clean, surgical hunting opportunities on the edge, that's just going to make it's going to make your season a lot more enjoyable, where you're not feeling like every day you're out here educating deer. Plus, in the long run, it should make you more successful.
It'll make the property hunt bigger because you don't have to go as far in. You got more strategic spots on the edges to play different winds or to change the scenery, or if that buck is using a draw a particular way, well, you may have two opportunities to hunt them because you're hunting so fringy. And we'll look at some of the food sources too. I know you've got some started, and then maybe we'll tweak some of those to create more of like concentrated areas. Because one thing that's really discouraging, I know you're mostly a bow hunter. Are you exclusively a bow hunter? No, I'll pick up a rifle if it's the right deer.
Okay. But the one thing that really frustrates me is trying to bow hunt out of gun stands. So you're on big feeding areas and you see all these deer and you think, oh man, how do I get within bow range of that buck? And every night he's kind of a little bit different area, coming out, and you move your blind, or you do this, or you move a tree stand, and next day he's on the other side. So it's really frustrating to hunt with a bow on big feeding areas. So I like creating smaller ones, little isolated spots where they might hit it first before they go out to the bigger area, so you create more of a close range opportunity. So I know that next ridge was one of those where we talked about maybe putting in a couple small clover plots that might focus some of that movement into a more bow hunting friendly setting.
Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails is brought to you by Redneck Blinds, Day 6 Arrows, Code of Silence Apparel, Fuse Accessories, and Hoyt.
We're at a spot on Rob's farm now where we're trying to figure out how much timber stand improvement it makes sense to do. And the question really comes up, why do I want to do it in some of these areas at all? Other places I can leave open and just thicken up what are the suspected bedding areas, and then leave some of these bottoms and side hills more open. There's been tons and tons of studies done on this stuff, and I've also done a lot of just practical, anecdotal experience with my own farm, and there's a lot of benefits to having thicker cover, more than just the browse that it might create. The part of it is it makes the farm hunt bigger. We've talked a little bit about that. They can't see you from as far away, so you can come and go a little bit easier without the deer knowing. But even more than that, I felt like my farm was at its best when it was thick, because the bucks weren't interacting as much. So you could have more, I would call them like dominant mindset bucks. They might not be necessarily the biggest antlered bucks, but they're the ones who are the most aggressive. That, let's say one's bedded right behind you here on that open ridge. I'll spin it around. Okay, so there's another ridge on the other side of this valley, and if there's another one bedded up on there, and they're sitting here looking at each other during the day. When evening comes, one of them is going to chase the other one off. But what if they don't see each other? Granted, this is pretty tight quarters, but take it on a little bit bigger scale. if they're not interacting, they don't have that sense of maybe territorialism to the extent that they do in a more of an open timber.
Social pressure kind of thing.
That's right. I felt like they tolerated each other at a higher density when it was thicker, and they weren't bumping into each other or at least seeing each other all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets kind of sketchy, it's like the science, but that's more just my own personal experience. I felt like my farm was at its best when it was thick.
Well, and when we're talking about some of this timber in particular that doesn't have real market value, whether you're trying to improve the timber for value or from a hunting standpoint, a lot of this other unvaluable timber maybe can go, or can fell and allow more regrowth for thickness, because it's not going to provide you value down the road.
Right.
Take the hunting value or the social stress off the deer by thickening to make your farm hunt better.
I think so. I mean, and it's always I won't say trial and error, because it's not necessarily a trial and error, but it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
Where you don't have to get the perfect formula the first year. Like, we could come in here and there's quite a bit of hackberry, and if there's not a local market for hackberry, that tree is really not serving you any purpose.
Sure.
All it's doing is robbing sunlight from reaching the ground. You could just come in here and take all the hackberry out, or all the hackberry, all the elm, and then pick a couple others, maybe some of these cedars that really aren't doing much good up on top here. You might only have to pick 3 or 4 tree species, and you could take out, to say half of your total TSI, demand.
Mm-hmm.
Then you wouldn't have to even mess with the oaks. You wouldn't have to make a decision between one scraggly oak tree or another one that looks better, right?
Right.
So you just leave them alone. So if you got enough junk, the decision is pretty simple. You just take the junk.
And then year 2, 3, you make decisions on those oaks or on additional cuts.
Right, because you'll see that the habitat has already changed. Has it changed enough?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to do it all at once. I mean, the ideal situation is if you do have a commercial harvest or you're planning on doing one, you do that first.
Right.
And then you see what it looks like after that, because then you can make your TSI decision based on what it looks like after your commercial harvest. But if you're not going to get a commercial harvest, like, there might be a little bit you could take in here, we've talked about it, but if there's not a real attraction here for a logger, you're probably going to have to go with a straight TSI type of a plan right from the beginning.
Right.
And if you're going to do that, then just take the junk. And then you can always come back later and take some of the other stuff that's maybe, not junk.
Right.
Because I never liked cutting oak. Some of the straight timber programs, like by foresters for timber value, they have you cutting oak.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're trying to train one tree, or now we got one tree that's getting too much competition, and let's get rid of the ones around it. And
right.
So they're trying to groom one specific oak tree to do really, really well, and then they move on and do another one.
Mm-hmm.
I just treated all the oak trees like they were special, and then
right.
and then took everything else. But I mean, having a consulting forester come in and mark some trees isn't a bad idea. It can get you off on the right foot, and then you can just move forward from there. But if it was mine, I would just pick a few species down in here, just say, let's just get rid of all of those.
Mm-hmm.
They're junk. And then you can always come back a year or two later and take more if you need to.
Sure.
I think it's a mistake to take too much too soon.
Yeah. Cliche, you can't put it back up,
That's right.
Those kind of things. But I get the value or the importance of doing something. That doesn't mean it has to be dramatic.
Right.
But if there's, like we call it, not valuable trees from a market standpoint, but it improves the habitat for the deer, and you start on year 1,
Yep.
there's steps to improvement. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be all or nothing.
Well, and I think it's easy to take the junk.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's junk for a reason. It's not, you're not taking anything that has potential long-term value.
Right.
So it's kind of a no-brainer. But when you have to make those decisions between this oak tree and that oak tree, or I think then you have to have an expert really come in and help you with that.
Makes sense.
Yeah. We've just been walking along here looking at the trees in this particular draw, and it was a little bit more straightforward than I thought, because there's enough junk here that if all you take out is, say, the odd basswood, the cedar trees, we looked at some hackberry, and then there's a few really rough looking oak that aren't going to amount to much. There's going to be enough to take out of here that you don't have to make that decision of any kind of valuable trees.
Right.
Something that might either produce acorns. Most of the oak you've got here are never going to produce boards, unfortunately.
Right.
But they can sure produce acorns. So yeah, just looking around, this is pretty straightforward. So what we came back to then was that question of how do you actually get it done? You know, how do you get these trees on the ground? And do you want them on the ground, or do you just want to, like the old hack and squirt, where you girdle around them and then you spray the chemical in there, then they die standing? I mean, I want them on the ground personally. I know different people have different ideas on that, but for me, there's a couple reasons why. One, I don't want that dead tree standing in the woods when I've got tree stands out there, or, potentially could be out there and then the wind kicks up and now what,
Right.
But the other one is even more compelling from a deer management standpoint is I want these tops from all these trees on the ground, because that creates a little bit of a buffer or sanctuary for the new growth to come up.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be fighting a deer density problem here as you continue to add more and more food to this property. And at a certain point, it's going to be really hard to grow any kind of browse that the deer like and have it be sustainable, because they're going to eat it as soon as it pops up.
Mm-hmm.
So at least if you drop these trees, you've got the crowns of these trees and some of the branches, and it keeps the deer from maybe foraging into every little corner of your property.
Every one of them.
Yeah. So, and I've seen that work. The tops do protect, especially these cedars, because there's a lot of branches, but they do protect a certain amount of the regrowth that's coming in later. But there's nothing really wrong with killing them standing and leaving them stand. Other than, like I said, it's
probably just easier for somebody to go in and do it that way,
Yes.
as opposed to the safety of cutting down a tree. Yeah. In this situation, I don't mind to have some help to knock the tree completely down. It's not that I'm using this part of the timber for a trail to walk down or for a four-wheeler path. This is just going to be use of for the deer, whether it be browse or bedding or whatever. So it falling and staying is probably preferred over the easier way of just girdling things and then letting them fall whenever they decide to fall.
Yeah, I think so. And then people will talk about hinge cutting and leaving the live tree down, and letting it grow like along the ground. See, I don't like that either, because what you're trying to create is browse. I don't really want this basswood tree growing along the ground, right? I want something else, some kind of forage. Well, I mean, we're even seeing coralberry here, and the deer eat that stuff. I mean, I don't really want a tree that I consider to be a junk tree to begin with, now still alive and growing. Yeah, they'll browse it, along the ground, but that's not really my goal. My goal is to have it dead.
Yeah.
But it does make sense sometimes to hinge cut when you're trying to create like a visual screen.
And I think there's some spots on the farm that may come into play, but
yeah. So yeah, I think we're going to wrap up the discussion of TSI, at least in this part of the property. And but anyway, coming back to the whole question of how do you get it done, somebody's got to market, I believe, because you have something specific in mind. You can't just hire somebody and say, hey, by the way, I want you to create some pockets and take out. You're going to come out here and go, oh man,
right.
I need to get rid of this farm right away.
Yeah.
So I think you have to take the spray cans and market yourself.
Yep.
And then if you're not cutting it yourself, at least you can instruct them, hey, these are the ones you cut down.
And then again, you can always come back the second year and mark a little heavier, or make a plan to improve what you thought was going to work once it actually comes into play.
And I think on your property, we've more or less focused on saying there's about 30 acres here that's going to be more of a short-term test area for TSI. And if you like the way this works, then you got the rest of it you can do, or you can phase it in over the next few years. But you got to learn. You got to learn the process, and you want to learn small. You don't want to learn by making big mistakes.
Right, sure. Yeah.
We're up out of the timber, and we're on kind of a marginal field edge, timber edge, kind of a transition area. And this is an old cattle pasture. In fact, the cows were on here last year, right?
Yep.
So they've only been off for a few months. Really, one growing season? Yeah, last year.
Almost a full year.
Yep. So it hasn't had a chance to really grow back well, but there's a lot of spots here that they're not habitat and they're not food. And like I was asking Rob, you know, if they, when he bought it, if they just threw those acres in or if he had to buy them. And of course he chuckled and said, well, yeah, of course I had to buy them. Well, if you had to buy them, then they need to do something for you. We can't just leave them as being marginal and useless. So we're addressing an area now. It's a few acres, but it's kind of rocky. I'll show you a few spots here where you can get a feel for what it looks like underneath the dirt. The question is whether or not we can actually grow, say, corn here, and if not, what can we grow then? If it's not going to be food, what kind of habitat can we grow? We can't just leave it sit. So we've already identified the fact that it's going to be locust trees. You can see them right there. One of the worst trees that God ever put on the earth, or it's going to be hedge. And neither one of those is really favorable. So we got to help nature along a little bit here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to walk this little section and talk about what some of those trade-offs are, what's possible here, and then come up with a plan for this little, it's probably 6 acres, roughly 5 to 6 acres. You know, I don't want something that just pass through. I want them to have something that they live in. So that's why this, to me, if it wasn't going to be corn, that would be a trial, a first-year trial. And if it doesn't work, then I would come back in and I would till this and I would plant. And we can talk about that further, you know, when the time comes. But I'd plant something that would grow in this kind of soil, and I would find probably some kind of a local oak.
Okay.
And then just sprinkle the acorns in here, and maybe there's a few other species, you know, that we can think of that we can add to this to make sure you're going to get something to grow. But if you till this, nature's going to find a way to fill it in too.
Sure.
Yeah. So you'll get a lot of diversity. But that's kind of the way I look at these kind of spots. Is not I want some kind of food here, but I want either corn or nothing.
Okay.
And possibly sorghum or something, but I don't want to have food next to the road.
Just gotta get more security.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. We're heading toward a spot now that we have to decide. You know, Rob needs to decide. I'll help him as best I can, whether to hinge cut some trees for screening near a road, or whether to actually drop them to the ground and then, you know, get some regrowth to come in. That's going to be our next piece that we look at. And hinging, it does serve its purpose, and this might be one of those spots where it makes sense. But just kind of getting back to the big picture, when I was here last time, I feel like we spent a lot of time kind of reprogramming your thought process on how to hunt it from the standpoint of how deep to go in. When we get to the other side of this property, the other side of this valley, there's a whole bunch of cedar trees that front up to the fields.
Right.
And we talked about, okay, how deep in do you really need to go? Because there's going to be a trail just inside those cedar trees. You know, maybe that's as deep as you need to go. And we'll take a look at that when we get over there. But this time around, it's more like specifically which types of trees am I cutting? You know, you've gotten maybe your brain around this whole, you know, hunting from the outside, you know, fringe hunting. And now it's like, okay, let's get back to making these actual changes to the property.
And I think the fringe hunting part of it, to put into practice, it's literally like on the area where the cedars are, the first trail in.
Yeah.
It's not the second, and it's not 10 more yards, just the third.
Yeah.
It's the first one. So once you embrace that thought or that idea, that's made it a lot easier for me to say, okay, I understand how I'm hunting this, so now the rest of it can just be beneficial to the deer to be left alone.
Right.
The spot we just came from a few minutes ago was literally inside the woods a few feet. To go 10 more yards just risks more intrusion, more scent, more chance of blowing deer. So the TSI benefits right here, the deer become less comfortable here.
Yeah.
So to really fringe it, really opens and expands more room for the deer, more habitat for the deer, and it allows you to look at the entire habitat scape differently as more useful.
Yeah, and I think a person just has to become disciplined in their approach to it, because it's so tempting to say, I want to cover 3 trails, or I want to, well, you're usually going to give up one of them when you do that, and unless it's a perfect situation where the terrain drops off really fast.
Right.
You're usually going to say, oh, I want to cover all 3. Well, you're going to cover 1 well, and 2 of them, they're going to pick you off. So you just have to say, okay, I accept the fact that every single deer that I see, I'm not going to be able to get a shot at, but I'm not going to spook him.
Yep.
And that's kind of what setting up the perfect hunting property is coming up with that game plan of how can I hunt this day after day after day for as long as it takes to kill the buck that I know is on here that I want to get, without messing it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's fun. I mean, that's the part I like. It's the, trying to solve that big picture puzzle, and then obviously what we're doing now is what goes on inside of there.
Well, and trying not to operate out of fear of, I'm going to get one chance at this deer.
Right.
It's not that he magically appeared and you've got one opportunity and you just missed it. It's more of, I'm creating an environment where he's comfortable.
Yeah.
Or there's does here, and so he's going to stay here. And because I didn't go deeper and alert those does, there's more of a chance that the buck is going to stay, work those doe families that are there, and provide you more opportunities. So if you're kind of dartboard throwing darts to hunt and pick stand locations, you may have one opportunity, but to have a more strategic way of it, you're providing more opportunity. You just have to trust the process to let it develop.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know. I'm not sure what I would do here. I mean, we're looking at about a 100-yard stretch where you've got road frontage that you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I screen this? Let's keep looking at it. I don't necessarily have an answer for you on that yet. So we've looked at it, and it's pretty thin. The number of trees in here in this area we thought about hinging is pretty low, so we'd have to hinge a pretty big area in order to make a visual screen. I just wouldn't want to wipe out that many trees, because right by the road, you're thinking, well, I'll just hinge it up by the road, but there's just not enough trees there. The road is behind me. I don't think I would do much here, to be honest with you. I would take out the junk, maybe take a few of the rough looking oak and just let the brush come in, because you can see there's already a little bit taller saplings trying to come in.
Well, and we're probably 10 months removed from cattle being on here in the timber browsing as well.
Yeah, so I think I'd let this one go. Like, here's some locust trees. I'd take all that junk. There's some hedge in here, but I don't think I'd try to hinge out a big enough area to make a visual screen here. I think it would just look really bad and you wouldn't accomplish your mission.
Okay.
We're in a food plot now on Rob's property, and this was one that you created last year. This was just a kind of a bit of an opening, right?
Yeah, just scattered trees.
Right. And how did you get the trees out? I mean, what did you do to create this?
I had a referral of a local guy who had the equipment and was willing to push trees out, and so we had to do some ground prep first in the spring in order to get something planted for the fall.
Was it a skid loader?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. There's a couple trees that are left that were too big for him to push over, but a lot of it was small enough he cleared it.
But you ended up with acre and a half, 2 acres?
Somewhere in there,
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty nice. I mean, you got to figure with all the timber around this would become, a killing spot soon enough, and might be just a little bit big for bow hunting, but you could sure cover the whole thing with a rifle.
Yeah, you could. The topography of the field, the shape of the field, the topography of the hillside kind of lends to pinching down to about 30 yards and splitting the field in half.
Yeah.
And that was, by the shape of it, told me where I thought I should put the blind. But now having to put it in here, obviously I got to be a little bit more flexible on how the deer actually use it instead of just what I think they should do in it.
Yeah. Experience will tell you that.
Yeah.
We've mostly been talking about habitat, but we're going to do a quick hunting update. There's a draw that comes out of the main valley here, crosses the ridgetop, and goes into a bedding area on the other side. And the ridgetop is open, real rocky soil. And again, it's similar to that other spot we looked at. I don't really know just yet exactly what you're going to do there, but I'll come up with some ideas what might grow in that. But the challenge is getting some kind of tillage deep enough to get seed into the ground. But so now we're looking at a spot here where trying to figure out, okay, how do we make the most use of any different wind direction? If we have a wind out of the south, it's blowing off the property to the north end, and Rob can come along that property line, pop straight up over the top of that ridge and down into this valley. And as you've noticed last year, especially sitting on it, the deer cross through here quite a bit.
Yeah. Whether it's coming towards this potential bedding across the hill or from a food plot we put down at the bottom, it was just a connection. And with this draw starting to thin out on this end, it made it easier to anticipate the real travel or the trail they were going to take to pinch it down to make it huntable.
Yeah, so those are the basic, simple aspects of this, is always coming in along the property edge and then popping in to a stand that's closer to the middle. So that one being is that you can go along the property line. There's not a lot of deer movement on that side. The deer aren't coming off the neighbor on that side.
Correct.
You can pop right straight down in here. So that's what we're looking at now. We're going to go up, look at the rocky soil, make a little loop around, and then look at some cedar trees. There's going to be another challenge here that we're going to play, and that is what to do with that side of the draw that's just loaded up with cedar trees.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how to manage that, how to hunt that.
And it's cedars that are mature, where they've grown and the limbs have quit producing, where it's just, you know, dead looking limbs that even the deer don't really want to walk through, or they have such a designated path because it's so tight. It makes it really difficult to pick and choose a narrow little 10-yard window to shoot.
So we got to make one, or several of them.
Right.
Yeah. We're into the cedars now on the other side of the draw. You can see how open this is. There's nothing growing underneath it, and the branches, the low branches on the cedar trees are dead. So there's really no value in any way from a habitat standpoint. All you're doing is just limiting how much sunlight gets to the ground. So this is that, I would say, the next big challenge on this property. And you can see over there where Rob's approaching from, how open that is. So we've got to figure this one out. It's going to come down to cutting down a bunch of cedar trees, I'm sure, and also creating some shooting lanes down from the upper edge, the outside shooting in to the first heavy trail. But we also have to figure out what we're going to do with these cedar trees just from a habitat standpoint, because it's basically a desert. So I think we talked about it when I was here last time, of just laying down quite a few of the cedars on the inner edge, not really hitting the stuff on the outside edge, because you want that visual buffer, like when you're coming and going. So having some cedars out there is going to be good for that. But once we get in here about 20 yards or so, just start laying cedar trees down.
It not only it's going to help the habitat, but then it also strengthens the use of that trail, because we're not blocking it, we're not impeding it, but then on the other side of it, where you may try to hunt that extra trail to hunt, now that's covered and blocked, and it just reinforces the one innermost trail.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you took the first trail in and felled the trees away from that towards the inside, that would make that first trail in even stronger, but it would create better habitat overall. Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Serves both purposes.
Yeah. We're on the inside edge now of these cedars that ring this side of the valley, and I can just visualize how much better that habitat's going to look when a lot of those cedars are laid down. See, I know some people like cedars. I just don't have a love affair at all with cedars, and on my farm, one of the high priority projects is eliminating the cedars. There are some purposes that they can have. They can be really good wintertime bedding because they're dark colored and the sun shines on them and it kind of retains heat. But there's nothing underneath the cedar tree that the deer eats. So from the standpoint of creating browse, they don't really serve a purpose. Whereas, so much of what we're doing is really devoted to creating browse. So it's kind of hard to tolerate cedar trees, in that kind of a setting. So we're gonna keep a thick row, roughly, let's say 20 yards wide, roughly, of cedar trees out to the edge, and then randomly or heavily, depending upon the mood that Rob is in, we're gonna knock down the cedars that lie inside of that. So that would create a pretty solid wall for a trail up against that line of cedars, but it would also create pockets and even maybe bigger areas of better habitat and better browse on the inside of the cedar thicket.
And you're talking about maybe in this situation doing 75, 80%, maybe not every single tree, but if when we're doing the pockets, it allows us time to let that play out and see how it regrows and how the deer react, and then maybe bigger pockets are created, or maybe then the last 10, 20% of the cedar trees are removed as well, to make a big enough impact to make it huntable and to improve it but still allow some of them in place, whether because of aesthetics or tree stand locations or something.
Yeah, you never have to go 100% one way or the other on this stuff, because you've got time, you know, and you don't have to do everything on year one.
Right.
You just have to get started, you know, and once you get started, you can learn from what you're doing. You can see opportunities. You can see stuff as like, oh boy, I need to open that spot too. But if you overdo it at first, you're always better off starting slow. I guess that's the whole lesson that I'm trying to teach is, you know, have a plan, but start slow until you get really comfortable with what it looks like as you start to cut this stuff down.
Well, we were talking about it earlier, whether it was perceived deer movement through a property, or you make a change in adding food and how all of a sudden the deer start using that food or traveling that property. Same way, you can envision, okay, all this needs to disappear, all this needs to be laid over. But if we do it, we jump in and we do it, but then we realize, hey, they didn't react the way we thought, or this wasn't as clean as I thought it was going to be. Let's step away from this for a moment, or let's go harder at it. Because most of the time in the deer woods, nothing really turns out the way you expect it to. It just allows a little bit more room for error. Yeah,
and I think you can see how they adjust to the small changes you make, and then you can play off that. But no, I think it's always wise. It's always wise to move slow when it comes to cutting stuff down. But on the other hand, hey, I got to come back. This is the caveat. It never pays to move slow when you're planting. You got to get right down to it. Don't waste any time. You can ponder cutting stuff down. You can take a little bit here and take a little bit there and see how, you know, how the cover reacts. But you can always come back if you plant and you say, oh, I planted too much. Well, mow it down.
Right.
But you can never get where you say, oh, I should have planted, or I wish I wouldn't have planted 10 years ago.
Right.
You're always 1 year too late. You know, get busy planting, take your time, be a little bit more cautious on the stuff you actually cut down.
True.
So Rob and I were just talking about, you know, is there a best stand location, and you know, the deer use this part of the farm or whatever, and I keep trying to stay away from those kinds of discussions, because in my experience, the best stands are the ones that you can hunt repeatedly without the deer knowing that you're hunting them, and then you just put your time in. You know, and maybe there are some where, yeah, if I could sit there, more of the deer cross, you know, through this bottom ditch or whatever, but you just can't sit there. So what's the point in it? The whole thing, the whole battle, and why some people consistently kill bigger deer than other people, I don't think they're necessarily like that much better at knowing what deer are likely to do. One of two things: they've either gotten really good at hunting one farm, and they're really careful in how they go about it, so the deer don't know they're being hunted. But the most important thing is the big deer are there. You know, so this whole project of saying, how do I make my farm hunt better? You make your farm hunt better by making it hold and attract the age class of bucks that you're after. Because if they're here, you can kill them. The biggest challenge in killing a 6-year-old buck is having a 6-year-old buck on your property to hunt. So that's the whole goal in my mind. All this, like when I do consulting, it's more about how do I get them there, and less about how do I kill them. It's fun to talk about how do you kill them, because that seems like the razor's edge, you know, of the blade, but it really is how he's got to be here.
And I think a lot of people think that it's like a secret, or like there's something that can be told, that when they go to the woods they see that. That's why there's so many articles about funnels, or so many, you know, blogs or videos about it. But it's really more of unpressured deer as best as you can of the right age class of deer. Because you made a comment earlier, you could kill him on 300 places on this farm. It's just being in the right one. Well, if you're interacting with your farm in an intrusive way, you're less likely to interact with him in those spots. So
he's not going to be moving naturally.
Right.
So if you think about that, like let's say there's a buck on his feet during the day, during the rut, and he's going through here looking for does. How many trees did he pass upwind of that if he'd have been sitting in, you could have killed him out of?
Thousands, hundreds.
So I mean, there's not like that one best spot. There might be a spot where the odds maybe are favoring you a little bit, but there's so many places where you could kill him. You know, so where can you hunt him and get away with it, and how do you get him there? Those are the two. I think those are really the two pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to solve always. We make it too complicated by thinking that there's a magic spot. that you have to understand how the deer move through every part of the property. I feel like all you need to know is that there are places you can hunt without them knowing.
And that they're moving through the property.
And that they're there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
One tree to the next doesn't make, I think, as big a difference once you consider the access or the intrusion.
Yeah. And he might be living on one end of your farm and not on the other. Well, you just hunt the side where he's living on, because your trail cameras have said, hey, the buck you're after lives down here.
Yep.
Then you can
Daylight's here more often.
You can just forget about the rest of the farm for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's kind of as far as I go. I don't try to figure out, okay, exactly where, you know, I want to know which part of my property he's living on, and then I try to find spots there where he's not going to know that I'm hunting him or any of the other deer.
Yep.
And if I can find those, I figure like, well, eventually I'm going to get him. But the challenge is getting him there in the first place.
Right.
So that's what we're all about. Getting a 6-year-old buck on your farm. Rob and I have made the loop all the way around the farm. We're back within about a quarter of a mile of where we started. And I think we got a pretty decent plan on how to change the structure of the habitat, you know, like the actual land management part of it. The hunting, like we talked about, is going to follow, you know, common sense. And it's not going to be maybe something that we have to sit down and say, oh, here's the spot, right? There might be a bunch of spots.
Sure.
But the other one that we haven't really talked about is the deer management itself. And with adding all this food, planting these ridges into crop, started out last year you had beans in here, and then you've worked it, and now you've got the upper end of it into winter wheat. Next year it's probably going to be corn. The deer are going to be coming here looking for food now. And without a lot of other food in the neighborhood, winter food especially, this place is going to get really popular. So you got to have some kind of a plan of how many does you're going to kill. You know, like, how do you manage the population once you start getting that much attention and that many deer start coming here for the food. So we got to figure that part out too, and Rob's going to do some research. I haven't dove into the regs for Kansas, but he's going to need some flexibility because on a property this size, you know, the old rule of thumb is you got to kill at least 25% to keep status quo of your herd, of your adult deer, you know, whatever that is, not fawns. So let's say if you want to bring the population down because you're attracting too many, you're probably gonna have to kill almost a third of the deer every year that are living here or coming here.
Right.
Or maybe more. I mean, that could be, I mean, if you attract 75 deer, you're gonna have to kill pushing 20 deer a year, you know, just to keep this place from
manageable.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's always the challenge, is when you make a property really good and really attractive, you can't let it overrun with deer, because then all the stuff that you're trying to accomplish, it gets short-circuited, because then you get too many deer and the bucks start fringing out. So you're creating this perfect world for them to live in, and then they get fringed out. And you don't want that, because you don't want that high density, and the bucks won't tolerate that high density, so they live just on the outside of it. You want to have it so that this is still inviting to the bucks. And so anyway, keep that in mind, that when you create the perfect world for the deer, you need to have the tools and the willingness to keep the population in check.
Just to keep the habitat at an optimum spot for the deer that are able to stay here.
Yeah. Yep. And even the stress, the bucks just don't like being right next to tons of other deer. You know, when they get to be a certain age, they'll just leave and live someplace else and come in during the rut. And you don't want that either. So anyway, that's the last thing, that kind of the last piece of this puzzle. We looked at a few spots where we could create these little kill plots. I call them staging area plots, where the deer come out of the bedding area, they hit these little small feeding areas before they transition out into the bigger feeding areas. Those are really good spots to hunt with a bow, because the bigger fields that you've got here, as fun as it is to see tons of deer out on them, they're really hard to hunt those spots with a bow.
And hard to continue to hunt without pressure in the deer, because there's so many deer, so many eyes and ears, noses that they're going to blow out of there when you try to leave. Or
yeah, so that was the other piece of the puzzle too that we're putting together. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this. This is what I do. You know, we'll sit down and come up with some specific action items after we get done, make a list and talk about, you know, what are the exact steps that need to go into place in order to reach the goals and meet some of the opportunities that we found while we were out here. But this is pretty much what I do. This is how I break down somebody else's farm, and of course it's the way I do my own too. You know, I focus on habitat first, food second, and how to hunt it third. That's kind of my order of the way I look at my own property, and when I'm consulting, that's kind of the same thing I look at is, you know, habitat, food, and then how do you actually kill them once they're there.
Yep.
So hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll I may do a couple more of these before the year's over, you know, taking a look at some of these properties, but I appreciate Rob's time. Rob,
Yep.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I love your farm. I'm looking forward to hearing all the stories of these big deer that you grow and kill here.
Looking forward to doing it.
Yeah, I bet you are. Well, thanks for joining us this week for this episode of Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails. See you back here again next week, and remember to always dream big.